Welcome, everyone. We are genuinely thrilled you've chosen to spend your time with us today.
Absolutely.
Whether you're commuting or at the gym or just finding a quiet moment for yourself. Right at the top, I want to ask a quick favor.
Yeah, please do.
If you value the kind of highly tailored, deeply researched analysis we do here, please hit that like button and subscribe to the show. It is the single most effective way to ensure these deep dives keep showing up in your feed, and it supports the work we do immensely.
It really does. And looking at the sheer density of the material we are unpacking today, this is one of those discussions you will likely want to revisit.
Oh, no question. Our mission today is an extensive, granular exploration of a really provocative 2025 ebook. It's titled Rewire for Strength and Joy, The Science of Male Happiness by Conrad Riker.
A very heavy title.
Right, and I'm going to pitch this directly to you, the listener, because the premise is intensely compelling. If you're listening to this, you're likely someone who is acutely aware of the shifting cultural landscape.
The friction.
The friction, exactly. Maybe you are looking at the history of our institutions, trying to understand how they operated before what many in men's rights circles or the manosphere describe as ideological capture by modern feminist or Marxist frameworks.
Which is a huge part of the cultural conversation right now.
It is. And if you have been observing these conflicting societal mandates, the quiet crisis of purpose, this book offers a rigorous roadmap out of the noise. It strips away the cultural posturing. It relies heavily on neurobiology, evolutionary psychology, and behavioral science to help men construct a resilient, unshakable framework.
A biological baseline.
Yeah. So I highly recommend picking this up as a companion to our discussion today. You can find the ebook right now on Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books. Also make a point to follow the author at Conrad Riker on Substack, where he continually expands on these frameworks.
But before we begin deconstructing the biological and psychological frameworks presented in the text, it is absolutely essential that we establish the parameters of our discussion.
Right. We have to set the ground rules.
Exactly. Because this book wades into some incredibly complex and often highly polarizing territory. It dissects modern gender dynamics, the evolution of feminism, the statistical realities of male outcomes, and the psychological architecture of the manosphere.
It goes everywhere.
It really does. And because these topics are deeply embedded in ongoing cultural and political debates, I want to make our position completely transparent to you. We are operating strictly as impartial analytical guides.
Neutral territory.
100% neutral. We are not here to endorse, validate, or condemn the political, social, or cultural arguments made by the author or by his critics.
Our objective is synthesis and analysis, not advocacy.
Precisely. Our responsibility is to faithfully map out Riker's arguments, examine the data and scientific literature he cites, and present the mechanics of his philosophy so that you have a comprehensive understanding of the material.
So you can make up your own mind.
Exactly. We are holding the text up to the light, examining it from multiple angles.
Total analytical neutrality. Let's get into it. The text immediately establishes its foundation by dispensing with the philosophical ambiguity surrounding joy.
Right. He doesn't view it as a mystical thing.
Not at all. Riker argues that happiness is not some transient state or an accident of circumstance. He frames it entirely as a biological skill, a state of neurochemical equilibrium that you have to actively engineer.
And he focuses on the big three.
Right. Dopamine, oxytocin, and serotonin. Now, assuming you're already familiar with the basic functions of these neurotransmitters, what is fascinating here is how he applies them specifically to the modern crisis of male motivation.
That is the crucial distinction. Riker doesn't just define the chemicals. He analyzes the modern environmental hijack.
The mismatch.
Yeah, let's look at the dopaminergic system. Evolutionarily, the dopamine pathway, the mesolimbic reward system, was calibrated for high-effort, high-reward survival behaviors. Tracking an animal for days, building a shelter, securing resources.
The effort came first.
Always. The effort preceded the neurochemical payout. What Riker points out is that the modern environment inverts this equation.
With hyperpalatable processed foods, algorithmically optimized social media, infinite scrolling, immersive gaming.
It provides a massive neurochemical payout with zero preceding effort.
But I want to push back slightly on the framing, or at least explore the friction there. Isn't telling someone to just fix their dopamine incredibly reductionist when we are living in an ecosystem that is quite literally engineered by multi-billion-dollar corporations to exploit that exact pathway?
It's like bringing a knife to a gunfight.
Exactly. It feels impossible.
It is a phenomenal point, and Riker actually addresses the asymmetry of that battle. He doesn't suggest it is a matter of simple willpower. He approaches it through the lens of neuroadaptation.
How the brain defends itself.
Right. When you flood the brain with these unearned massive dopamine spikes, the brain defends itself by downregulating dopamine receptors. It literally removes the receptors to handle the overflow.
Which raises the threshold for pleasure.
Yes, meaning everyday activities, a conversation, a walk, reading a book, they no longer register. You are plunged into a state of induced anhedonia. The baseline is destroyed.
Which brings us to a highly illustrative case study from the book. Riker details his work with a former addict who had chased the absolute extremes of dopaminergic release through illicit substances.
Chasing the highest possible spike.
Yeah. And when this individual achieved sobriety, his subjective experience of daily life was entirely devoid of color or interest. His reward circuitry was so profoundly downregulated that ordinary existence was agonizingly dull.
And this is where the concept of rewiring moves from theory to practice. The individual didn't just wait for time to heal his brain, he engaged in aggressive, targeted neurorehabilitation.
He utilized deliberate, effortful engagement to rebuild the neural architecture. He began running, just a single mile initially. He took up painting.
Building micro goals.
Exactly. He constructed a framework of micro goals. Every time he completed a run or finished a canvas, he forced his brain to associate the effort with a natural endogenous dopamine release.
It wasn't an immediate spike.
No, it was a slow, agonizing process of resensitizing his receptors through analog, high-effort behaviors until a new, sustainable reward system was established.
It is a brutal but necessary process of recalibrating the machine. Now, shifting the focus to oxytocin, we move from motivation to integration.
The love hormone.
Right, while it is frequently oversimplified as the love hormone, Riker examines its role as a potent anxiolytic peptide. In the male brain, optimal oxytocin levels are inversely correlated with cortisol and directly correlated with social integration and stress resilience.
He references a highly compelling study there.
The nasal spray study.
Yes, involving the administration of exogenous oxytocin via nasal spray to male subjects. This was fascinating. The localized delivery mechanisms bypassing the blood-brain barrier to directly stimulate the amygdala.
Precisely, and the observed outcomes were profound. The subjects exhibited a marked decrease in social anxiety, a heightened sense of connectivity, and a significant attenuation of threat response behaviors.
They felt safer.
They did. The broader implication Riker draws from this is vital. If oxytocin is the biological antidote to the isolation and hypervigilance that characterizes so much of the modern male experience, how do men stimulate its production naturally?
Especially since men are frequently conditioned toward stoicism, hyperindependence, and emotional compartmentalization.
Right. How do you get the oxytocin without a nasal spray?
He illustrates the practical application of this through a client who is an overworked executive and father. This man was operating in a state of chronic sympathetic nervous system arousal.
High cortisol, high adrenaline.
Totally disconnected from his family despite living in the exact same house.
A very common modern scenario.
Extremely common.
Yep.
And the intervention Riker prescribed wasn't a radical career shift or years of psychoanalysis. It was an aggressively protected 15-minute daily routine of tactile, focused engagement with his children.
Just 15 minutes of absolute unfragmented presence.
Yes. But the key was the type of presence. Eye contact, physical play, reading together, activities that require mirror neuron engagement and tactile feedback.
Physical touch releases oxytocin.
Exactly. The father reported that this micro-intervention didn't just improve his relationship with his kids, it functioned as a biological release valve for his own stress.
He was self-medicating.
By intentionally triggering endogenous oxytocin production, he was effectively self-medicating his chronic cortisol levels. He was using the biological mechanics of fatherhood to stabilize his own nervous system.
It is a brilliant example of behavioral endocrinology in practice. Finally, we must look at serotonin, which Riker frames as the master regulator of mood and circadian architecture.
The sleep foundation.
Right. When serotonin levels drop, the result is not just mood lability, it is a cascading failure of sleep structure and impulse control. He shares the account of a man who is trapped in a cycle of severe insomnia and chronic dysthymia,
where pharmaceutical interventions had proven largely ineffective or fraught with unacceptable side effects.
So he returned to the absolute biological fundamentals. He treated his body as a synthesis plant.
I love that framing, a synthesis plant.
He optimized his intake of tryptophan, the essential amino acid precursor to serotonin. He rigorously managed his light exposure, ensuring early morning sunlight to trigger the cortisol awakening response and anchoring his circadian rhythm.
And he ruthlessly audited his sleep hygiene. Not just the basics, but completely eliminating blue light exposure to allow for the natural conversion of serotonin into melatonin.
And the resulting stabilization of his mood and sleep architecture underscores a core tenet of Riker's philosophy. The brain is an incredibly sophisticated, entirely literal machine.
It can't just make happiness out of nothing.
It cannot synthesize stability out of thin air. It requires the correct biological substrates and environmental inputs. Riker also connects this to the phenomenon of the runner's high.
Oh, right, demonstrating how intense voluntary physical exertion forces the release of endorphins and dopamine. It serves as an immediate physical override to a deteriorating mental state.
Which provides a seamless transition into the text's deep dive into genetics.
This is where the conversation often gets highly deterministic. People think, well, I have bad genes, so I'm doomed.
But Riker uses the famous axiom from neurobiologist Robert Sapolsky to anchor his perspective. Genetics loads the gun, but environment pulls the trigger.
It is a vital framing device. It acknowledges biological reality without surrendering to biological fatalism.
You were born with a specific genetic hand. Predispositions, vulnerabilities, structural advantages. But the expression of those genes is entirely contingent upon the environmental stimuli and behavioral choices you expose them to.
The case studies he uses to explore this are incredibly nuanced. He details the study of identical twins, Mark and David,
Separated at birth.
separated at birth and raised in starkly contrasting environments. One in a high-stress, densely populated urban center, the other in a tranquil rural setting with differing socioeconomic pressures.
Yet longitudinal studies revealed that their baseline levels of subjective well-being and emotional resilience were remarkably unified.
Which forces us to acknowledge that the genetic floor and ceiling are robust. The hardware matters. But Riker's application of this data is not to induce apathy. It is to demand a rigorous, almost clinical self-awareness from the reader.
Let's examine the case of John, the tech CEO. He discovered through genomic sequencing that he possessed a specific variant of the DRD4 gene.
The novelty-seeking gene.
Yes. For those familiar with behavioral genetics, DRD4 is heavily implicated in novelty seeking, impulsivity, and risk tolerance.
In a modern context, individuals with this variant often struggle with gambling, substance abuse, or chronic instability because their neurobiology demands constant, high-stakes stimulation.
But here is the genius of the intervention. Rather than viewing this genetic variance as a pathology to be suppressed or heavily medicated, John recognized it as an evolutionary adaptation that was merely mismatched with a mundane environment.
Mismatched hardware.
Right. In a hunter-gatherer of the paradigm, the individual compelled to seek out the unknown territory over the next ridge is the one who discovers the new water source. The trait is adaptive.
But in a modern cubicle, it is destructive.
So, John engineered his environment to utilize the trait. He channeled that intense dopaminergic requirement for risk into entrepreneurship.
He effectively weaponized potential liability by placing it in an arena where high-risk, high-reward novelty seeking is highly compensated.
That is exactly the kind of strategic self-awareness the book advocates. He presents a similar paradigm with Alex, who carried a variant of the SLC6A4 gene.
The serotonin transporter gene.
Yes, and specific polymorphisms here are strongly correlated with amygdala hyperreactivity, making an individual highly susceptible to generalized anxiety and magnified threat perception.
So Alex's brain was constantly sounding the alarm.
Constantly. And again, Alex didn't resign himself to a life defined by generalized anxiety. He utilized that diagnostic insight to proactively engage in advanced cognitive restructuring.
He employed targeted cognitive behavioral therapy and rigorous mindfulness protocols.
He essentially trained his prefrontal cortex to manually override the exaggerated threat signals being generated by his amygdala. He recognized that his alarm system was overly sensitive, so he built a secondary cognitive system to verify the alarms before reacting to them.
But the most striking example for me was Mike, the former military operator. Mike's genomic profile revealed a variant of the MAOA gene. Now, I want to pause here because in pop science literature, this is often sensationally dubbed the warrior gene.
Due to its association with aggression, lowered impulse control, and antisocial behavior.
Right. And that sensationalism is dangerous because it borders on the very genetic determinism Riker is trying to dismantle.
Exactly. When Mike received that information, he could have easily used it to justify volatility or anger issues.
Instead, he recognized that this genetic variant, which essentially affects the degradation of neurotransmitters like dopamine and serotonin, provides a massive reservoir of raw, aggressive energy.
Raw material.
So he took that biological raw material and subjected it to the crucible of elite military training and intense physical discipline. He refined an innate propensity for aggression into profound emotional resilience and tactical leadership under extreme duress.
This entire section serves as a masterclass in the emerging field of epigenetics, the understanding that our behaviors, our diet, our stress levels, and our environments create chemical tags on our DNA that literally turn the expression of specific genes up or down.
Like the story of Tom.
Yes, Tom possessed significant genetic predispositions for depressive disorders. Through a draconian optimization of his diet, gut microbiome, and physical exertion protocols, Tom fundamentally altered his epigenetic expression.
He didn't erase the genes, he effectively muted them. He proved that the blueprint is not the building.
And when discussing the physiological foundations of the male experience, the text inevitably confronts endocrinology, specifically testosterone. Riker refers to it as the hormone of kings.
Which sounds poetic, but he grounds it entirely in neurology.
It is critical that listeners separate testosterone from the caricatures of hypermuscularity or unprovoked aggression. In the context of male neurobiology, testosterone is a vital cognitive modulator. It dictates spatial memory, motivation, effort-based decision-making, and overall vitality.
The narrative of John, a 45-year-old executive, perfectly encapsulates this. He sought intervention because he was experiencing profound cognitive decline, severe brain fog, lethargy, irritability, and a complete collapse of executive function at work.
The assumption was burnout or early onset depression.
But a full endocrine panel revealed his free testosterone was clinically deficient. Once that hormonal baseline was optimized through targeted lifestyle and medical interventions, the cognitive symptoms vanished. His executive function was restored.
Then there was the behavioral impact, illustrated by another client, Mike, who was completely paralyzed by risk aversion in his career. He was terrified to negotiate a salary increase or pursue advancement.
Upon correcting a significant hormonal imbalance, the physiological shift produced a psychological transformation.
The renewed dopaminergic drive, facilitated by optimal testosterone levels, completely altered his risk assessment. He successfully negotiated his advancement and initiated an independent venture. The lesson here is stark. Your neurochemistry dictates your behavioral horizons.
And this inherent plasticity of the brain is the ultimate message of part one. Neuroplasticity isn't just a buzzword, it is the physical mechanism of change. Riker explores this through the harrowing account of a combat veteran suffering from severe treatment-resistant PTSD.
Traditional talk therapy was insufficient because the trauma was literally encoded into the physical structure of the amygdala and hippocampus.
Which is why the intervention had to be structural. The veteran utilized EMDR eye movement desensitization and reprocessing.
This modality employs bilateral sensory input to effectively hijack the brain's memory reconsolidation window.
By forcing the brain to engage in bilateral processing while simultaneously recalling the traumatic event, it literally rewires the neural pathways, stripping the memory of its physiological terror response. The veteran successfully remodeled the physical architecture of his trauma.
So, the synthesis of this foundational section is a mandate for biological ownership. Before examining psychological or cultural distress, you must audit the machine.
Are you chronically dehydrated, resulting in reduced cerebral blood flow? Riker notes a manager whose pervasive cognitive dysfunction was resolved simply by optimizing hydration to 3 liters daily.
What is the state of your gut-brain axis? He details the necessity of microbiome diversity, incorporating probiotics to modulate systemic inflammation, which directly correlates with depressive symptoms.
He explores the profound cognitive clarity achieved by a 50-year-old educator who implemented rigorous intermittent fasting. This stabilized his insulin levels, reduced neuroinflammation, and created a sustained state of mental acuity. Taking physical sovereignty is the non-negotiable prerequisite to mental strength.
Which is the perfect bridge, because no amount of optimized brain chemistry exists in a vacuum. You optimize the internal machine, but then you must navigate it through a highly volatile, highly complex external environment.
Which brings us to the second major segment of the text, navigating the cultural crossfire and modern feminism.
And I must reiterate to you, the listener, as we enter this heavily debated territory, we are acting purely as mirrors to the author's sociological critique.
Absolutely. So we transition from the biological imperative to the cultural reality. Riker posits that modern men are operating within a profound psychological double bind. a cultural catch-22.
On one hand, the contemporary social mandate insists that men dismantle traditional stoicism. They are instructed to be highly vulnerable, to prioritize emotional transparency, and to default to egalitarian passivity.
Yet Riker argues there is a covert parallel mandate that severely punishes men when they actually comply with the first.
He asserts that when men do exhibit profound vulnerability or emotional fragility, they are frequently met with diminished respect, loss of attraction from partners, or professional marginalization.
Conversely, when men exhibit the traits biologically reinforced by their neurochemistry, assertiveness, competitiveness, the drive for dominance and provision, they are swiftly pathologized under the umbrella of toxic masculinity.
He points to a highly revealing 2018 study from the University of Bath, which quantifies this exact contradiction. The data suggests that while societal rhetoric demands a softening of masculinity, the professional and social hierarchies implicitly demand and reward traditional masculine traits.
Riker's critique of the toxic masculinity framework is that it fundamentally conflates evolutionary adaptations with genuine pathologies like unprovoked violence or sociopathy.
The very traits required to build civilizations, defend communities, and drive innovation are being pathologized.
By blurring that line, society induces a state of chronic guilt in men for their baseline nature. It is, as he describes it, the ultimate damned if you do, damned if you don't scenario.
And this psychological bind is ceaselessly reinforced by modern media architectures. Riker conducts a fascinating analysis of the archetypal flattening of men in contemporary entertainment.
If we look at the last 2 decades of highly consumed sitcoms, shows with massive cultural footprints like Friends or The Big Bang Theory,
The male protagonists are predominantly characterized by social ineptitude, emotional immaturity, or a kind of endearing incompetence.
it's the ubiquitous trope of the bumbling, overgrown adolescent. You see it relentlessly in advertising. The father figure is almost uniformly depicted as incapable of executing basic domestic tasks.
Operating a washing machine or managing a toddler.
Exactly, requiring the exasperated competence of the female figure to restore order.
And the alternative archetype provided by media is equally distorted. In the realm of interactive media, particularly blockbuster video game franchises like Call of Duty or Grand Theft Auto, masculinity is singularly equated with hyperviolence, emotional numbness, and pure kinetic dominance.
Riker's argument is that by oscillating strictly between the bumbling fool and the hyper-violent operator, the culture denies men access to complex, integrated, pro-social models of masculinity.
Which leads directly into his critique of broader socioeconomic narratives, specifically the pervasive discourse surrounding male privilege and the gender pay gap.
This is where the text becomes sharply contrarian. Riker asserts that the mainstream framing of these issues relies on aggregate data that deliberately obscures massive strata of male suffering and sacrifice.
He argues that discussions of a systemic pay gap frequently ignore the variable of extreme physical risk. He says it's a sobering demographic reality. In the United States, men constitute 93% of all workplace fatalities.
93%. It is an astonishing metric that is almost entirely absent from mainstream cultural discourse.
Men overwhelmingly populate the foundational, high-risk infrastructure roles of society: deep-sea welding, commercial logging, mining, high-voltage line work, and emergency services.
Riker posits that characterizing the economic landscape as merely a construct of unearned male advantage fundamentally disrespects the literal mortality rate men endure to maintain civilization's infrastructure.
Furthermore, he systematically dismantles the concept of universal male privilege by highlighting the demographic realities where men are categorically failing.
The statistics he aggregates here are grim. Men represent the overwhelming majority of the unsheltered homeless population. They constitute over 90% of the incarcerated population. The male suicide rate outpaces the female rate by a factor of 3 to 4.
And perhaps most concerning for the future, the educational architecture is failing boys at an alarming rate, with boys falling significantly behind girls in reading proficiency, high school graduation rates, and university enrollment.
Riker's contention is not to create a hierarchy of victimhood, but to argue that the relentless cultural drumbeat of male privilege creates a profound empathy gap. Society becomes structurally blind to male despair.
He suggests that systemic interventions, such as gender quotas that prioritize demographics over competence, or the enforcement of neutered, gender-neutral language.
Like the replacement of specific pronouns with terms like folks.
Right. These are not merely linguistic shifts. They are ideological tools that erase the specific, lived reality of manhood, leaving men feeling culturally unmoored and systematically sidelined.
And inevitably, this analysis requires an examination of feminism's impact on the male psychological landscape. Again, Riker approaches this with significant nuance. He does not offer a blanket condemnation.
He explicitly credits the feminist movement for dismantling suffocating, historically rigid stereotypes and for successfully advocating for necessary legal and economic equalities. He acknowledges that it has granted men greater permission to engage in fatherhood and emotional expression.
However, he defines the current iteration of feminism as a profound double-edged sword for the male psyche. It has generated a landscape of massive cognitive dissonance.
The modern man is explicitly instructed to be an egalitarian co-pilot, to decenter his authority and to champion female leadership. Yet simultaneously, the covert evolutionary expectations remain firmly intact.
When a crisis occurs, when financial stability is threatened, or when physical security is breached, the deeply ingrained cultural and biological expectation instantly reverts to the man as the immovable rock, the provider, the protector.
It is an impossible tightrope. You are expected to be fundamentally egalitarian until the exact moment you are required to be fundamentally traditional.
And Riker observes that the exhaustion of navigating this contradiction has given rise to the digital phenomenon known as the manosphere.
The emergence of groups like MGTOW men going their own way and the broader incel community.
Right. And Riker's analysis here is essentially a hazard warning. He completely validates the initial impulse that drives men to these spaces. Men possess a profound, biologically driven need for male-centric spaces, for brotherhood.
Arenas where they can discuss the unique friction of their existence without the threat of being pathologized or shamed.
But the architecture of the internet transforms that valid search for community into a highly toxic feedback loop. Riker warns that these digital enclaves frequently devolve into echo chambers of ideological despair.
The algorithms reward the most extreme, polarizing content, shifting the culture of these groups from mutual support and self-improvement into collective resentment, nihilism, and complete alienation from the broader social fabric.
Finding a tribe is vital, but surrendering your agency to collective bitterness is psychological suicide.
And it is crucial to note that Riker doesn't view the male experience as a monolithic entity. He integrates the principles of intersectionality into his critique.
He meticulously points out that the friction experienced by a white man navigating corporate expectations is vastly different from the friction experienced by a black man,
who must navigate the additional layers of historical systemic prejudice and entirely different, often hyper-scrutinized, societal expectations of his masculinity.
By acknowledging these intersectional nuances, Riker isn't capitulating to modern academic jargon, he is insisting on accuracy. A man cannot effectively navigate his environment if he doesn't have an accurate map of how society specifically perceives and pressures his particular demographic.
So we have established the biological foundation and mapped the chaotic cultural environment. To truly synthesize the solution, Riker argues we must look backward. This brings us to the third major pillar of the text, the evolutionary roots of male behavior.
His core thesis here is the concept of evolutionary mismatch. To understand why a man feels a profound sense of purposelessness in a modern office, you have to understand the environment his brain spent hundreds of thousands of years adapting to.
We are operating hunter-gatherer hardware in a digital abstracted world.
Exactly. Riker utilizes a brilliant anthropological contrast here. He examines the Hadza tribe of Tanzania, one of the last remaining true hunter-gatherer societies.
The daily existence of a Hadza male is defined by immediate, tangible stakes. They track game, they navigate physical terrain, they endure physical risk, and they return with caloric resources that directly ensure the survival of their kin.
The feedback loop is immediate, the effort is physically demanding, neurologically engaging, and the reward is absolute. Their biological imperatives are perfectly aligned with their environmental requirements.
Now, contrast that neurobiological architecture. A brain optimized for risk assessment, spatial navigation, and direct resource acquisition with the reality of the modern knowledge worker.
You take that identical hardware with all of its dopaminergic and testosterone-driven demands, and you place it in a climate-controlled cubicle.
You ask it to stare at a glowing rectangle, manipulate abstract data on spreadsheets, and wait 2 weeks for a direct deposit so it can outsource its provision to a grocery store.
It is a recipe for absolute psychological disintegration. Riker illustrates the sheer weight of this abstraction through the story of a highly successful Wall Street executive.
By every modern metric, this man was at the apex of the hierarchy. Immense wealth, status, power.
Yet he reported a pervasive, crushing sense of emptiness. He was totally alienated from his own nature. The intervention he sought was an extreme, immersive wilderness survival course. For weeks, he was stripped of his status and forced to engage in primal tasks.
Friction fire starting, celestial navigation, foraging, tracking.
And the psychological recalibration he experienced was profound. By forcing his brain and body to re engage with the direct, unmediated tasks of survival, he achieved a level of clarity and deep fulfillment that decades of abstract corporate achievement could never provide.
He temporarily resolved the evolutionary mismatch.
Riker expands this concept into what he terms the masculine continuum. He asserts that the male neurobiology is inextricably wired with the provider instinct. For the vast majority of human history, a man's intrinsic worth to his tribe was entirely dependent on his capacity to secure resources and defend the perimeter.
The tragedy of modern urbanization is that it has completely abstracted this process, leaving the biological drive intact, but rendering the modern outlets for it profoundly unsatisfying.
And this evolutionary lens is vital when Riker addresses the complexities of modern relationships. He dives into the often uncomfortable biological realities of sex differences, referencing phenomena like the Coolidge effect.
I want to unpack this carefully because it's crucial.
It is. The Coolidge effect is a well-documented phenomenon in mammalian biology where males display a renewed high-level dopaminergic and sexual response upon the introduction of a novel female, even following states of sexual satiety with prior partners.
From an evolutionary perspective, the male reproductive strategy often prioritized genetic dissemination and novelty, whereas female evolutionary strategies, burdened by the immense biological cost of gestation and child rearing, heavily prioritized resource stability, emotional fidelity, and long-term pair bonding.
And Riker's inclusion of this is not to construct an alibi for infidelity or poor behavior. It is an exercise in rigorous honesty. He's explaining that men and women are attempting to build lifelong monogamous partnerships while running on fundamentally different underlying biological software.
When you understand that the male brain is fighting a million-year-old evolutionary mandate for novelty, the friction in modern monogamy stops being a personal moral failing and becomes a biological hurdle that must be consciously intellectually managed.
Which leads directly to Riker's theory of the identity crisis cycle. He proposes that during periods of massive societal upheaval, such as the unprecedented renegotiation of gender roles we are currently living through, the male collective undergoes a predictable sequence.
The dismantling of historical rules generates deep, pervasive confusion. This confusion eventually centralizes into a profound identity crisis. But Riker frames this crisis not as a collapse, but as the necessary crucible for adaptation. Chaos forces evolution.
The crisis demands that men forge a new, more sophisticated identity capable of operating in the new paradigm.
He provides a deeply moving example of this process in action. He details a support network that formed in Norway, comprised of men spanning multiple generations, from their late 20s to their mid-50s.
These men didn't gather to complain about society. They gathered because they were all being crushed by the exact same evolutionary tension. They were agonizing over how to reconcile the deep biological imperative to be the stoic, unshakable primary provider with the very real, modern requirement to be a highly communicative, emotionally porous, egalitarian father and partner.
It is the defining tension of the modern household, and it requires understanding how the institution of marriage has mutated. For millennia, marriage was a pragmatic, transactional, and strictly hierarchical institution. It was a mechanism for property transfer, survival, and social stability.
The expectation of self-actualization or profound emotional romance within that structure is a remarkably recent historical invention. Today, the expectation is that a marriage must be a perfectly egalitarian partnership that also serves as the primary source of profound emotional and sexual fulfillment.
That is an immense architectural shift. To demonstrate how to navigate it, Riker presents a case study from Canada. A couple had operated under a deeply traditional dynamic for over 20 years. He was the sole financial provider, she was the primary domestic manager.
The friction ignited when the wife decided to pursue a demanding career, entirely destabilizing their established equilibrium. They were forced into a chaotic, painful process of completely renegotiating their domestic and emotional contracts.
But the crucial takeaway Riker emphasizes is that the husband did not experience a reduction in his masculinity by adapting to this egalitarian reality. True adaptation does not mean capitulation into passivity. It requires a synthesis.
It means retaining the core virtues of traditional masculinity, the capacity for leadership, decisiveness, and protectiveness, and integrating them with advanced communicative fluency, deep empathy, and emotional intelligence.
He specifically highlights the necessity of physical touch during this transition, anchoring it back to our earlier discussion of oxytocin. The tactile connection acts as the neurobiological stabilizing agent, keeping the partnership's foundation secure while the structural roles are being fiercely debated and redesigned.
So we have audited the biology, mapped the cultural hazards, and examined the evolutionary context. How does the modern man operationalize this knowledge? This brings us to the final and most crucial segment, actionable strategies.
And Riker bases his strategic framework heavily on the ancient philosophy of Stoicism.
But he doesn't present it as an academic exercise. He frames it tactically, specifically through the operational psychology of elite military units like the Navy SEALs.
The foundational axiom of Stoic philosophy and the core of SEAL resilience training is the absolute bifurcation of reality into things you can control and things you cannot.
You cannot control the macroeconomic climate, you cannot control the shifting cultural dictates regarding masculinity, and you cannot control the opinions of others. You have absolute sovereignty over only your own actions, your own cognitive framing, and your own discipline.
It is the ultimate prophylactic against the paralyzing mindset of victimhood. And Riker is careful to redefine self-discipline. It is not a punitive mechanism. It is not about aesthetic deprivation. It is the architectural foundation of self-efficacy and self-esteem.
He illustrates this with the story of a man who suffered from a profound lack of agency. He felt entirely adrift, undisciplined, and physically lethargic, having never run more than a single mile.
The intervention was not a motivational seminar. It was a physical commitment to complete a marathon. The genius was in the execution. He did not attempt a 20-mile run on day one. He constructed a rigid architecture of micro goals. Every day he executed a small, predetermined physical task.
And by doing so, he leveraged the dopaminergic system we discussed in part 1. Every completed micro goal delivered a structural hit of dopamine, reinforcing the behavioral loop.
When he eventually crossed the finish line of the marathon, the physical achievement was secondary to the psychological metamorphosis. He had empirically proven to himself that he could exert absolute dominion over his physical form.
And if he could architect his physical reality, he could architect his psychological and professional reality.
Riker couples this internal discipline with a mandate for environmental shifts. He insists that men must periodically remove themselves from the hyper-stimulating synthetic urban environment to practice this stoicism.
He advocates for aggressive immersion in nature, navigating difficult trails, enduring the elements. This isn't just about fresh air, it is a neurological necessity. It silences the relentless cognitive load of modern existence and forces the parasympathetic nervous system to reset the baseline.
This naturally leads to his specific theories on male connectivity and camaraderie. Riker is an enthusiastic proponent of the men's shed movement, a phenomenon that originated in Australia and has seen rapid global adoption.
The insight driving this movement is incredibly profound. Modern therapeutic culture often insists that the solution to male loneliness is to place men in a circle and demand face-to-face emotional vulnerability.
Which, for a massive percentage of the male population, is deeply uncomfortable and ultimately counterproductive.
Exactly. The men's shed movement recognizes that male bonding, historically and evolutionary, occurs shoulder to shoulder, not face to face.
These sheds are essentially communal industrial spaces. Men gather to engage in tangible mechanical tasks, restoring engines, building furniture, machining metal.
There is zero mandate to discuss trauma or dissect emotions. The focus is entirely on the shared external objective. Yet through the process of collaborative problem solving, the physical proximity, and the shared exertion, a profound camaraderie organically develops.
They are quietly dismantling the epidemic of male isolation through the proxy of shared labor.
And the mechanism underlying this is tied directly to the neuroscience of mentorship, specifically the function of mirror neurons. These specialized brain cells fire both when an individual executes a specific action and when they observe another individual executing that same action.
It is the neurological foundation for observational learning and deep empathy. When a young man stands beside a seasoned mentor, observing how he handles a complex mechanical problem, or more importantly, how he regulates his frustration when a task fails, the younger man's brain is literally running a physiological simulation of that emotional regulation.
Riker highlights the story of Bill, a retired mechanical engineer. Bill possessed decades of highly specialized knowledge, but retirement had plunged him into a crisis of irrelevance. The cessation of his career severed his sense of utility.
His intervention was to begin actively mentoring young apprentices in his former field. The transmission of his expertise did more than elevate the apprentices, it fundamentally resurrected Bill's sense of purpose.
He recognized that his ultimate value was not his economic output, but his capacity to shape the next generation. His legacy became his purpose.
Which culminates in the apex of Riker's actionable pyramid, the absolute biological necessity of adventure, spirituality, and the pursuit of meaning. Riker does not treat adventure as a recreational luxury. He treats it as a psychiatric requirement.
The data he presents to support this is staggering. He cites research from the University of Michigan indicating that men who consistently integrate rigorous outdoor adventure and physical risk into their lives exhibit a 25% lower risk of developing clinical depression.
A quarter reduction in depressive outcomes simply by engaging with risk.
Because the deliberate engagement with risk forces the brain into a flow state. This is a concept pioneered by psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi.
When you are navigating a Class 4 rapid or managing a precarious rock climb, your cognitive bandwidth is entirely consumed by the immediate physical reality. You do not have the processing power to ruminate on office politics or societal expectations.
The prefrontal cortex essentially shuts down the default mode network, the area responsible for self-referential anxiety. The result is a state of hyperpresence that aggressively flushes cortisol from the system.
Riker tells a phenomenal story of a corporate executive who was essentially dying of stress. His blood pressure was critical, his marriage was strained, he was operating in a state of perpetual emergency.
Instead of taking a standard vacation, he orchestrated a radical intervention, a 6-month, high-altitude mountaineering expedition. The sheer physical brutality and life-or-death simplicity of the environment served as a total system reboot.
He described it as a reset button for his soul. He returned, resigned from the toxic corporate environment, and ultimately spent months sailing solo across the Atlantic. He reconnected with the primal male imperative to conquer the physical unknown.
And this demand for depth extends beyond the physical into the intellectual and the spiritual. Riker makes a compelling case for the necessity of spiritual practice, completely divorced from rigid religious dogma.
He points to neuroimaging studies, specifically fMRI scans of practitioners like the Dalai Lama, which empirically demonstrate that dedicated contemplative practices physically increase the density and activity of the prefrontal cortex.
The exact region of the brain responsible for emotional regulation, executive control, and the subjective experience of joy.
He also challenges men to aggressively expand their intellectual horizons, advocating for a synthesis of seemingly contradictory philosophies. He suggests that a man should deeply study the works of Friedrich Nietzsche to grasp the concepts of raw, individualistic strength, the will to power, and the absolute rejection of victimhood.
But he insists this must be immediately balanced by a rigorous study of Eastern philosophy, Buddhism, or Taoism. To cultivate compassion, the dissolution of the ego, and profound mindfulness,
it is the deliberate cultivation of extreme cognitive flexibility, the ability to hold immense personal power and deep humility simultaneously.
And the final anecdote he shares to illustrate this integration is brilliant. A group of men in their 50s initiated a book club. Initially, the premise was entirely superficial. A socially acceptable excuse to escape their domestic responsibilities for an evening, sit in a garage, and drink beer.
However, as they committed to the text and the process of debate, the architecture of the group transformed. They began challenging each other's deeply held dogmas.
They utilized the books as proxies to finally discuss their own marriages, their fears of aging, and their search for meaning. It evolved from a superficial gathering into a profound, life-sustaining intellectual and emotional tribe.
It forces you, the listener, to confront a hard truth. Are you actively constructing your tribe? Are you intentionally seeking out the environments that will demand your physical, intellectual, and emotional evolution?
So, as we attempt to synthesize the sheer volume of information we have covered today, Conrad Riker's Rewire for Strength and Joy presents a remarkably comprehensive, unflinching roadmap.
It is a mandate that demands you assume absolute, uncompromising ownership of your biological machinery, your neurochemistry, your endocrinology, and your physical resilience.
It requires you to navigate the incredibly complex, often contradictory cultural mandates of the modern era with a cold, analytical neutrality, refusing to be radicalized into bitterness or crushed into passivity.
And ultimately, it calls you to systematically engineer a life defined by deliberate purpose, physical adventure, and deep shoulder-to-shoulder camaraderie.
It is, at its core, an operational manual for reclassing your agency.
And I want to leave you, the listener, with one final, deeply provocative concept to consider long after this deep dive ends. We've spent a long time dissecting the profound friction between the ancient, wilderness-adapted male brain and the hyper-sanitized, highly complex modern world.
A mismatch.
Right. What if that friction, the frustration, the exhaustion, the profound sense of dislocation that so many men are experiencing right now, what if that is not evidence that men are fundamentally broken?
Or that society is irredeemably corrupt.
Exactly. What if that exact painful friction is the necessary evolutionary catalyst? What if the agonizing pressure of this current cultural transition is the exact required mechanism to force men to evolve, to forge a completely unprecedented, infinitely stronger, and profoundly integrated paradigm of human partnership for the next century?
That is a staggering perspective shift. The pain is not the pathology, it is the process. If you are ready to stop passively observing your life and start actively, biologically engineering your joy and strength, I cannot recommend this book highly enough.
It will definitely change how you view things.
Go secure your copy of the ebook, Rewire for Strength and Joy, The Science of Male Happiness by Conrad Riker. You can find it right now by checking out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books. And to ensure you continue to receive these high-level insights, make sure you follow the author at Conrad Riker on Substack.
It is a text that will fundamentally challenge the metrics by which you measure your life.
Without a doubt. Thank you all so incredibly much for dedicating your time and focus to this deep dive. One final reminder, please hit that like button and subscribe to the show so you are always notified when we drop a new analysis. We deeply value your curiosity and your commitment to doing the hard work of understanding. We will see you next time with more mind-expanding content. Take care.